about an hour and 15 minutes. I'd like to welcome everybody. I know people are still tricking into this gigantic Zoom room. We have over 100 participants, as I understand it. So let me start first off by welcoming everyone who is continuing to come into the room. I also want to thank the Fund for Santa Barbara and the Fund staff, and Stanley in particular, for putting all of this together. And I want to welcome Alice Rubalcaba, who will be providing simultaneous Spanish language interpretation. And I want to pause for a moment to let Alice give us some instructions about how to use the interpretation function. Alice?
Thank you, Alice. This is a bilingual message and we'll repeat it in English. Hola, mi nombre es Alice Rubalcaba. Este es un mensaje bilingüe que será repetido en inglés. Voy a interpretar la presentación del día de hoy entre inglés y español. Un ambiente bilingüe virtual exitoso depende de todos y todas, no solamente de los intérpretes. Pueden ayudar teniendo en cuenta los siguientes puntos. Hable claramente para asegurar que podamos escucharlo. Hable a un ritmo moderado. Tengan cuidado de no hablar demasiado rápido para que no se pierda nada de información. Solamente debe hablar de una persona a la vez para no tener que decidir a quién interpretar. Hablen en el idioma que les sea más cómodos o cómodas. Puede ser inglés o español. En un momento más, el anfitrión activará la función de interpretación y es momento de seleccionar su pantalla un canal. Puede seleccionar inglés o español en la parte de abajo del icono. Si quiere ayuda con su conexión, por favor mande un mensaje por vía chat al anfitrión. Gracias. Hello, my name is Alice Rubalcaba and I'll be providing interpretation between English and Spanish for today's presentation. A successful virtual bilingual environment depends on all of us, not just the interpreters. You can help by keeping a few things in mind. Please speak clearly to ensure we can hear you. Speak at a moderate pace. Only one person should speak at a time, so we don't have to choose who to interpret for. Speak in whichever language you feel most comfortable, English or Spanish. In a moment, the host will turn on the interpretation feature. This will allow you to hear when speakers of both languages talk, but in your language of preference. Select Spanish or English. If you're having any trouble with the interpretation feature, please send a message via chat to the host. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alice. Well, once again, I think people are continuing to join, so let me once again welcome everyone to this very important discussion hosted by the Fund for Santa Barbara. We will be discussing community-based efforts in the region to end racism and build a more just and sustainable economy. We're also going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the Schools and Communities First ballot initiative that is going to be, it now has a number, Proposition 15. It's going to be on the November ballot. My name is Alice O'Connor. I'm a professor of history and public policy at UCSB, and I also direct the UCSB Blum Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy. I have to add here that we've been proudly called out on the Wall Street Journal editorial page as one of those left-wing commie organizations because we happen to be the host of a minor in poverty, inequality, and social justice. So that gets one called out on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal these days. I'm also a member of the Fund for Santa Barbara Board of Directors. Now, I want to, just a couple of housekeeping things. Due to the large number of participants, we'll have the video and audio turned off for all but the panelists, which is admittedly a bit strange for us. We're just talking to, it feels like we're talking to each other, but we know we're talking to a larger audience, but we know you're out there and we are very grateful for your interest and participation. At the end of our discussion with the panelists, which should go for about an hour, we'll have a Q&A with our panel, and so I encourage everyone who's listening to consider submitting questions that you have for our panel. You can start submitting questions now and at any time during the conversation.
Y pueden empezar a poner sus preguntas en cualquier momento dentro del icono que está en la parte de abajo de su...
We'll get to those questions as time allows. So let me just say a couple of things to start us off, just kind of by way of introducing and setting the stage for what we're going to be talking about today. As a historian, I do want to start by acknowledging that we are in a historic moment of reckoning. It's a political reckoning, a social reckoning, but above all, a moral reckoning. A reckoning that's been sparked by the intersecting and compounding crises of the pandemic and of state-sanctioned violence and brutality against Black people, as we witnessed in the terrible murder of George Floyd that we have seen countless times on our video screens, and the worldwide protests that it sparked. But it's also a reckoning with democracy, and with the future of democracy, as we continue to witness the vast and growing disconnect between public sentiment, and especially the sentiments we're hearing all around us on the streets in ongoing protests, and the discussions that are going on among our elected officials, especially in Washington. What these crises have in common is that they are rooted in centuries, but really more immediately in the past several decades of deepening and growing and dramatically polarizing economic, racial, gendered, environmental, and in all ways intersectional inequalities. These are inequalities that can be traced to policies and politics that have systematically undermined what we know makes democracies possible and makes them vital. Education, health, public goods, basic well-being, and also a shared and just system of public safety that we all can believe in and that none suffer from. These are, sort of, I'm constantly invoking these things, but we're talking about freedom from want and freedom from fear for everybody. These are the things that make freedom of speech and freedom of association possible and make them vibrant. These are the things that make democracy vibrant. So these are the things that we want us to keep in mind. And then in a lot of ways that sort of galvanize the moment of change that we find ourselves in, and that we hope can structure and form the vital context for today's conversation. In today's conversation, we want to have the opportunity to start thinking about collectively a different kind of future, one in which we commit not simply to returning in the wake of these multiple crises we're facing. We can't simply return to the old normal. We actually need to make a change to move toward a more just and equitable economy. This broader context is very consistent, and addressing and keeping these broader goals in mind is very consistent with the mission of the Fund for Santa Barbara. I have to add here, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. And for 40 years, the fund has been working to advance progressive change by strengthening movements for social, political, and environmental justice. So as part of our conversation today, our intent is to discuss how the crises of pandemic and systemic racism have galvanized a massive grassroots call to reinvest in democracy by reinvesting in communities, in schools and communities, and in well-being. So as part of this, what we want to do is highlight two regional efforts. One, and this will just be a mention that you'll be hearing much more about in the coming months. But one that the fund has been working actively on in conjunction with others is the Regional Equity Study, the Central Coast Regional Equity Study. It's a collaborative effort that's led by the fund, by USC's Program on Environmental and Regional Equity, and by the UCSB Blum Center, and in which all of our speakers in various ways are taking part of. What we intend to do with this regional equity survey is to unearth some of those deep structural inequities, the structural inequities that were there before pandemic, that are there and have been exacerbated and deepened by the pandemic and that we need to address in the wake of the pandemic. The second thing we want to draw our attention to, and we'll have some actual discussion of today, is the Schools and Communities First ballot measure, Proposition 15. And we want to underscore, first of all, what it is, but also its importance as an immediate and kind of concrete measure and organizing opportunity that we can use as to launch, but also to further this ongoing effort for broader change. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn to introduce our panelists and begin a Q&A in which we first discuss how everyone is thinking about and how we ought to be thinking about these deeper inequalities that have been surfaced by the combination of pandemic and the crisis of racial inequality. But we then we'll turn to some discussion with initiatives that are going on at the community level. And finally, we'll turn to some discussion of the Schools and Communities First ballot initiative. So now to our panelists. First, we have, I want to welcome and thank all of our panelists for participating. Our opening speaker will be Dr. Manuel Pastor. Manuel is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California. He currently directs the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity and the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration. Soon, those two are going to be combined to become the Equity Research Institute. Manuel's research has focused on issues facing low-income urban communities and social movements that are seeking to change what we've been talking about and what we're dealing with on this panel. His most recent book is State of Resistance: What California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence Means for America's Future. Currently, Manuel serves on the Governor's Recovery Task Force that's been convened to help inform how the state can best address the concurring crises that we all face. Our second panelist, Marisela Morales. Marisela is a longtime community organizer here in our region. She is the executive director of the Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy, better known to many of us as CAUSE. Marisela is also the former mayor of the city of Port Hueneme and is an appointed alternate member of the California Coastal Commission. Our third panelist is Dr. David Pello. He is an active founding member of the Central Coast Climate Justice Network and a distinguished professor of environmental studies and the chair of the UCSB Environmental Studies program. I have to add here that it just celebrated its 50th anniversary this year. David also directs the Global Environmental Justice Project. Okay, so I want to turn to some questions. Again, first starting with a question to set the stage for our more specific discussion of what's going on in the community and with the Schools and Communities First ballot initiative. Our first question is then, we're witnessing a powerful moment of public consciousness as these intersecting crises of pandemic and systemic state-sponsored brutality are revealing very deep-rooted structural inequities in the US, in California, and in our region. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists to comment on the nature and extent of the inequities they've been encountering in their work, how they've been deepened by the pandemic and associated economic crises, and especially how they're playing out in California and regionally on the Central Coast. We'll start with Manuel.
Great, well, thank you, Alice. I think on behalf of all the panelists, first, thanks for such a graceful introduction, and second, perhaps no thanks for such an easy question. It's a pretty big and dramatic thing. So let me say a few words. to maybe get a conversation going. There's a phrase, sentence, quote that's been going through my mind over and over again in the last month or so, which is that there are some decades when nothing happens, and there's some weeks when decades happen. And I think that we've been through those weeks of COVID, unveiling the systemic inequality and vulnerability in our economy, people who lacked health insurance, people who lacked wealth as a cushion when their jobs were lost, people who are undocumented who lacked access to any kind of relief from the federal government, people who were incarcerated who lacked any degree of humanity and respect being given to them to try to protect them from this crisis. So that, I think, was a kind of lifting of the veil on the deep inequalities in the American economy and the systemic racism as well. Because if you were tracking from the beginning, you could see what has since emerged in the data. The disproportionate impact in terms of both COVID cases, but particularly deaths on the Black population in California and in the United States. And then also, particularly recently in California, the disproportionate impacts on the Latino population, where for the age group between 18 and 49, Latinos are about 43% of that prime working age population, but 73% of the deaths that are occurring amongst that prime working age population here in California because of their role in farm work, in essential work, etc. So COVID had kind of lifted the veil on racism and inequality, and then the murder of George Floyd was a kind of spark to a tinder that was already there and has really seared a kind of broad awareness of systemic racism, and not just amongst the communities that had experienced it on the short end of that stick. That is, it's no gigantic shock to Latino communities or African American communities that there's unequal policing, unequal schools, unequal environment. In many ways, policing is just the tip of a racist iceberg in which all these other systems beneath it are also producing inequality. But what's interesting about this moment is the widespread recognition among the broad swath of the American public. So to watch the fact that the marches that are going on are maybe led in many cases by African Americans, but joined by Latinos, Asians, whites, joined in particular by young people, there's a kind of breaking open of consciousness which is occurring. Now, there's COVID, there's George Floyd, but I think it's important to realize that this is coming on 3.5 years of Trump. 3.5 years of seeing a brutalization of the poor, a marginalization of Black communities, a demonization of immigrants, a rejection of science, not just climate science, but even good social science around the fact that if you have immigrants in your community, it's actually a safer community, around the facts that over-policing and over-incarceration have been locking a generation of African-American men in particular out of the labor market, facts about how if we actually address poverty and inequality, we'll have a more prosperous economy for most of us. So we've seen a kind of brutalization of people, a brutalization of science, and I feel like the uprising that's going on right now, it is an uprising against systemic racism, but it's a kind of declaration that we are tired of this ugly face of Trumpism in America. We recognize the othering and marginalization that it's caused, and people are ready for something fundamentally different. Whether or not this election delivers it or not, people are fundamentally ready for it. And the last thing I'll say, because I really want to hear from the rest of our speakers on this, is I feel like for many of us, this is the moment we've been training for all our life. The work that I've been doing to try to document environmental disparities. It's so obvious to people right now that there are environmental disparities when you look at the way in which poor air quality has contributed to COVID. The work that I've been doing trying to document that unless we fully incorporate our undocumented immigrant brothers and sisters, we are not going to have a healthy society. That's so clear right now in the public health data that if you're allowing undocumented people to get sick, it's just going to create more sickness for the entire society. The work that we've been doing about racial inequity, it's so clear right now. And I think so many of us have been doing this work. This moment has occurred. And the real question is, are we as researchers, organizers, and leaders going to step up to this moment and provide an alternative vision for the Central Coast, to be sure, but for California and the nation?
Thank you, Manuel. That's a great start. Marisela.
Yes, thank you. So in terms of what we're seeing here on the ground with COVID and lifting up some of the challenges, right, that people are living with. Cost started with the living wage movement 20 years ago. And a lot of our focus in COVID has been back with the focus on workers, and specifically undocumented workers. And in terms of how we're seeing, almost 200 years of that racism and exploitation that we're aware of, how it continues to manifest specifically on farm workers. Farm workers, we've had them since before statehood. Agriculture has been important to the state since even before statehood. The first law, I only learned this last year, the first law that the California legislature passed, even before statehood, so it was April 1850. The state became officially a state in September of 1850. The first law was the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. And the purpose of that law was to facilitate stealing land from Native Americans, but it was also to facilitate a free labor force for agriculture. Children were able to be removed from their families for the purpose of putting them to work in agriculture. And here today, 2020, almost 200 years later, farm workers are still very much at the center of whether it's the wildfires or COVID. We just had an outbreak here in Oxnard at an H-2A guest worker labor camp, where almost 100% of the guest workers, about 200 workers, were diagnosed positive with COVID. Santa Maria is next to Salinas, the place with the most H-2A guest workers for agriculture in the state. So we are, continuing to organize to lift up the state of farm workers as well as undocumented workers. What we're seeing statewide in terms of COVID is that immigrant workers, non-citizen workers have been the hardest hit. 36% of immigrant women, they're the ones that have been hit hardest, have either lost their job or lost hours. So that economic burden without a safety net is playing out very much here at home, and look forward to sharing more information about how we have been organizing, but also, as Manuel said, how we can keep an inspiring vision and aim for something better post-COVID.
Okay. Thank you, Marisela. David?
Hello, thank you so much, Dr. O'Connor. It's a pleasure to be here today. I also just want to say it's wonderful to share this panel with Marisela and Manuel. In terms of what we're witnessing, I mean, we're seeing so many intersections of different social forces, environmental injustices and racial violence, for example. And I think the focus on disparities is really important, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But I think it's just as important to talk about the driving forces between these crises or behind these crises. They are birthed in the cauldron of capitalism and racism. I consider what's going on in the US South, which is my birthplace, which is often called the Bible Belt. Sociologist Robert Bullard actually calls it the stupid belt. He calls it the stupid belt, the southern United States, because of the deep irrationalities and self-destructive nature of public policy in that region. It's no coincidence that the US South is significantly impacted by white supremacy and racism. We're seeing that today. Just look at the maps. The southern US has some of the highest rates of anti-Black violence, also anti-LGBTQ violence, some of the highest rates of cancer and other environmentally induced diseases, which might be related to the fact that it's a region with some of the most relaxed and negligent environmental health and safety regulations anywhere in the country. And of course, some of the highest rates of COVID-19. This is a region that we think of as the Black Belt because the majority of African Americans have historically lived there. And it's also, of course, a place where the brutal institution of slavery, of human enslavement, was concentrated. And where today, as we see in the media and all around us, we see a hotspot of pitched battles over the legacy of the Confederacy. So we've got to recognize the driving forces behind the disparities in order to confront the disparities that go back to earlier eras of conquest and slavery. And so speaking about slavery, enslavement continues today. In the US prison system, as was mentioned earlier, it's legally allowed under the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And so that brings us back to the issue of disparities. Here in our region of the Central Coast in northern Santa Barbara County, of course, we have the Federal Correctional Institution at Lompoc, where the vast majority of inmates there have contracted COVID-19, just like we've seen in prisons all over this country and all over the world, making this place one of the largest clusters of the pandemic in the country. And so prisons are COVID-19 hotspots for several reasons. Physical distancing, which as we know is required to slow or prevent transmission of the virus, is impossible in prisons, where overcrowding and close quarters is rampant by design. The medical care system in prisons and jails is abysmal by design. Pre-COVID, it was a catastrophe. Third, of course, an overwhelming number of inmates suffer from pre-existing medical conditions such as asthma and hypertension. Anytime I research a prison, I see the documentation on the health issues, the illnesses, the underlying conditions that people are addressing. Hypertension and asthma are always there. This makes folks more vulnerable to disease and illness. Moreover, as we know, if you're paying attention, the vast majority of prisoners in the United States are people of color and immigrants. So this crisis is compounded by the fact that these are populations who are at higher risk of succumbing to the virus, regardless actually of which side of the prison wall they reside on, because they're more likely to suffer from pre-existing health conditions, tend to have poorer access to our healthcare system, and face significant health disparities more generally in society. Why am I talking about prisoners? Because these are our family members. They're our friends. They're our community members, many of whom, as was noted earlier, are in prison precisely because of the criminalization of poverty and the over-policing of our communities. So in my research, I've found prisons to be a particularly acute site of environmental injustices and racism because there are places where there's widespread water, food, and air contamination, and where we have vulnerable populations. I'll end on a positive note. And that is that prisons are also a terrain of inspiring activism and leadership, where incarcerated people are spearheading movements for environmental justice, human rights, decarceration, and abolition. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for taking on a very big question. And I also want to note, I appreciate the way you're keeping it real, as in you're not sugarcoating any of the challenges that we face. But at the same time, you're keeping that emphasis on, yes, we have huge challenges, but we also have to keep our eyes on the prize. And that's precisely the kind of balance we're trying to we're trying to go for in the discussion today. So with that in mind, I want to turn now to the role of action and movement activism around these issues. I mean, one of the striking things about the moment we're in is that despite the fact that we've been sheltering in place and maintaining physical distance to the degree we can, these crises have been accompanied by an extraordinary and varied degree of organizing and activism, whether in the form of the insistent data gathering that has revealed these vast disparities, whether it's in the form of the activism at the state and local level that has helped with the issues of protections against foreclosure and eviction, whether it's in the form of the rapid response funds for undocumented community members, and of course, the sustained protests sparked by George Floyd's murder. So I'd like each of you to reflect on the activism that you're witnessing around these issues. Again, without diminishing the enormity of the challenges we face, what efforts are you finding most promising in moving towards meaningful change? Manuel, can we start with you?
Sure. Well, gosh, I'm in Los Angeles where students just organized and got 25% cut out of the Los Angeles Unified School District police budget. They had a vision actually of abolition of the police within the schools, and initially went in with a ask for a 90% cut, but eventually won a 25% cut, step in the right direction, and where our police department after years has also seen its budget growth basically curtailed, less than what the activists were asking for. So I think there's a lot of impact that's going on. I think the question is kind of how to both see what's going on and then have more impact. So to get back to the quote I started with, some decades, nothing happens, weeks when decades happen, but behind those weeks are often decades of organizing and work. So, Black Lives Matter didn't just pop up as George Floyd was being murdered on the streets of Minneapolis. It's been organizing and laying some groundwork for about the last 7 years at least. And it's dovetailed with a bunch of groups that I know David could talk even more eloquently about that have fought for justice reform, have fought for prison abolition, and a number of other things. The work that's going on around immigrants didn't just pop up by noticing the disparities in the COVID crisis. There's been fantastic work around mobilizing the undocumented to speak for themselves. And you yourselves in the Central Coast region are blessed with an organization like Cause, which since its beginning has been intersectional and really intersectoral, raising issues of economic justice, of immigrant rights, of racial justice, and of environmental justice, all in the same breath, and actually creating coalitions that reach into the middle class as well, who should begin to realize that their ultimate interests are not with corporations seeking to strip assets from all of us, but rather with poor and working people who, when they get their rightful due, lead to a society that's much healthier. So I'm optimistic. Let me say what I think are a little bit of the worries right now that I think are important. One is to not mistake a moment for a movement. This is a really big moment. And there have been movements that have been preparing for this. Again, Black Lives Matter has been at it for a while. But, it's not organized at a scale that can actually meet the moment of what's going on. And it's not Occupy, where Occupy pretty quickly fell apart after its moment in the sun. And it's interesting to see BLM intersecting in the state with groups like Pico, California, which is much more institutional and is able to raise some of the same issues, but have an institutional infrastructure. And I think we're in kind of a really interesting moment, just like the world is breaking open for lots of new things to happen in terms of, defunding the police, in terms of immigrant rights, et cetera. The world is breaking open for new forms of organizing. So the kind of leaderful, non-institutional sort of strategy that BLM has been taking for some while, how does that exist next to what a cause has been doing, next to what a PICO has been doing, and how do we figure out how to articulate all of these moments? And one of the reasons why this is important, and I'll be quiet, but you can tell I'm excited about this, is because we're in a epic-making electoral season in which it is absolutely imperative that, I guess this is a 50C13 call, so I'm saying this in an entirely 501c3 way. It is imperative that Trump get defeated at the polls in November. And what's interesting about this, and what's really motivated me, is something that Angela Davis said the other day when people were saying, well, are you excited about the candidate that's probably the candidate that will be running against Trump? And she said, you know what? I'm not voting for him. I'm voting for me. Mm-hmm. We are talking about a future in which the course correction we make now, a course correction away from race baiting, a course correction away from poor bashing, a course correction away from denying science, a course correction away from not embracing our relationship with planet Earth. That course correction is so critical right now because it's not just the South that has become the stupid belt. The nation has become the stupid belt in the last 3.5 years. And unless we reject that stupid belt and recognize that the same racist, anti-poor, anti-science, anti-environment impulses are all part of a beast that's within us that needs to be defeated. It's really just a crucial moment.
Thank you, Manuel. And on the 501c3 note, I will say that everything you said can be backed by empirical evidence. So definitely a 501c3 comment. Marisela, can you talk some about what you're seeing here on the Central Coast? You've already mentioned some of the ways in which causes work has been affected by the pandemic, but where are you seeing some openings for moving ahead with causes, racial and economic justice agenda?
Yeah, so here locally, I want to lift up two campaigns. One that is focused at the local level, another one that absolutely has local ramifications, but the campaign is at a statewide level that we can all participate in. At the local level, in terms of housing, we began with COVID in terms of activating our base around housing because that's their number one issue, housing and income, those two issues. And so we did gain local moratoriums around evictions. Those are coming to an end at the end of this month. And, people have still not been working. And so we're gearing up for pushing for protections against housing displacement here at our local level. Otherwise, we will see mass displacement, mass homelessness of families if we don't address the housing issue. And how are people supposed to pay for rent when they haven't been working and when they're undocumented and don't qualify even for unemployment insurance? So we do this, as Manuel said, and we all know that it's the organizing with the people themselves that are most directly impacted. For them, they are the experts of their own lives and leaders of their own lives and of our community to push for these policy initiatives. But we also do this with coalitions. And so all of this work, want to lift up, Cause does it in coalition with probably many folks that are listening to this right now. So the other one that I want to lift up is very much about our undocumented workers in our region. Santa Barbara County is #2 in the state in terms of the percentage of residents that are undocumented in the state. And they do not qualify. If they're workers, they've been workers, but they're undocumented, they don't qualify for unemployment insurance. So they've been getting 0 since March. And so we're part of the Safety Net for All statewide campaign. And folks can help us out by putting in a call to our local legislators as well as the governor's office, because we need his leadership on this. He has been just inactive, I should say, in terms of addressing unemployed workers. So those are the 2 campaigns that are the focus right now.
Great. Thank you so much. David, you gave a powerful example when you talked about prison abolition movements, but can you talk a little bit more about how all of these intersecting issues are coming together in your own work and in environmental justice campaigns, locally, but also elsewhere?
Sure, thank you. So yeah, I guess I could start by talking a bit about some of the collaborative work that students who I'm working with at UCSB are doing in support of a Green New Deal in the Central Coast, and more broadly on the front of environmental justice and climate justice, all of which is meant to support efforts to secure racial justice in our region and the state. So the Central Coast, as we know, like elsewhere in this country and in the world, is a place where environmental and climate justices are really rampant, where immigrant communities, people of color communities face greater environmental and climate threats than the rest of us, despite the fact, and this is really important, it's not just the disproportionate impact of pollution and other environmental and climate threats, but it's despite the fact that those communities have far fewer negative impacts, contribute far less, are far less responsible for environmental and climate impacts. And that's really the heart of what environmental and climate injustice are about. So again, disproportionate and unequal harms on communities that are the least responsible for creating these problems. These communities have contributed the least to the problem of global climate disruption, but are on the front lines of the crisis as they are more likely to live near coal-fired power plants, the leading contributor to climate gas emissions. And of course, widespread asthma and other respiratory illnesses follow from that. These are communities that suffer from extreme temperatures and urban heat islands. They pay more of their income toward energy bills and experience the brunt of agricultural losses and food shortages associated with climate-related events. So what we're doing at UCSB in the Environmental Studies program and the Global Environmental Justice Project is teaming up with the Central Coast Climate Justice Network to conduct research to support key campaigns in the region that are focused on delivering climate and environmental justice. And we've done this in a number of ways. And so one is we've been doing research on fossil fuel extraction projects, like the Cat Canyon proposed development of some 700 oil wells in North County, the ExxonMobil Highway 101 trucking scheme that would endanger our flora and fauna, our water systems, our public health. We're analyzing the environmental impact reports associated with these projects. We're distilling this information into publicly accessible and digestible formats. And our students have been attending public hearings to promote environmental and climate justice concerns. We're also researching and supporting a fair and just transition for fossil fuel workers, so that while we work to phase out environmentally destructive industries, we simultaneously are working to invest in good paying, safe, and unionized jobs that can enhance and protect our ecosystems and our social systems. Closely related to that is an effort by UCSB students and our Climate Justice Network partners to produce research and a database that will provide a foundation for the development and the implementation of a Green New Deal for the Central Coast. And this Green New Deal, unlike any others, will be deeply driven by grassroots empowerment and listening, doing house meetings, listening to people all across the region. Finally, we've been working on creating a zine. A number of students have produced an illustrated and highly accessible short book that's called Tracing the Footsteps of Onshore Oil. This will be publicly available very shortly and addresses oil and climate justice concerns in our region, and is really intended to serve as an accessible resource for education, for the public, and for organizing. And I want to say that as the Black Lives Matter movement and the COVID crises have hit us, we have been infusing into all of this work an urgent message of solidarity with Black and diasporic communities, and an articulation of the point that there is no climate justice without racial justice. Why? Well, in a nutshell, because we know that the very first financial supports that made possible the Industrial Revolution in particular, and capitalism more generally, that made these systems possible, these same systems that, by the way, produced anthropogenic climate change, the very first supports that made these systems possible came from what? Came from where? They came from the conquest of indigenous peoples, from the enslavement of indigenous peoples, and from the enslavement of African peoples in this hemisphere. So another really important point I want to make is that nobody apparently is waiting until the November elections. And no one with a brain cell left in their head truly believes that the Trump regime is guaranteed to fall in the next election, because they are hell-bent on cementing a stranglehold on this nation, no matter what they have to do, no matter what laws they have to break, no matter how indecent they have to be. So people are not waiting. That inspires me, that gives me hope. Across numerous institutions and sectors and organizations, we're seeing amazing changes happening right now in response to these crises and the urgency of the Black Lives Matter movement. Or maybe it's a moment, as Dr. Pastor might have said. This is about changing the way we allocate public funds, changing practices and policies related to hiring, investments within media organizations, within corporations, universities, etc. For me, that's another way of thinking about public policy and society, making society changes beyond the ballot box. And for me, this is the most positive and hopeful I've been in a long time. And I can't believe I'm saying that. But it's empowering because it underscores that we can make changes every single day of the week, today, right now. And these are changes that can materially impact and improve our lives immediately in our workplaces, in our schools, and our homes. And so combining that alongside our work at the ballot box is very, very important. And this is why I have called for, among other things, a fair and just transition, not only for fossil fuel workers, but also for prison workers, but also for law enforcement workers. So the current national discussion about defunding and divesting from police departments is really important, but it hasn't quite grasped this point, because it tends to advocate simply taking money away from law enforcement and investing it in other worthy sectors like education, healthcare, green industries, and so on. We need more nurses, we need more teachers, we need more mental health care providers, we need more workers building renewable energy and public transportation grids and affordable housing. So in my view, what would make those proposals to defund and dismantle police departments more robust and politically feasible would be to offer law enforcement and corrections officers the opportunity to transition into those more socially and environmentally sustainable jobs. So let's have a fair and just transition for everyone.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to just go back to your point about the importance of public policy. And even though, yeah, I appreciate the point about not just looking to the ballot in November, but we do have a ballot coming up in November. So this is a great segue to the last thing that we want to talk about with our panelists before opening it up to questions. And that is the schools and communities first. Now officially Proposition 15, I'll say it again and again and again, that is going to be on the California November ballot. So this is a structurally promising measure that's been gathering widespread and growing support from California educators, healthcare providers, labor, civil rights, and racial justice organizations, progressive grant makers, and many, many others. Now, in brief, very briefly, it would undo one of the most problematic legacies of Proposition 13, that tax limitation measure that was passed in 1978. It would tax commercial and industrial property at fair market rates. essentially recovering an estimated $12 billion in tax revenues for K through 12, community colleges, and municipal and county governments. Proponents see this as a concrete first step, and I emphasize the first step, toward rebuilding California's capacity to fund public goods and to build coalitions for change. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists to reflect on an aspect of schools and communities first. I do want to first turn to Manuel and ask if you can briefly give us some historical context about the impact of Proposition 13 to really underscore to folks why this decades-long movement to reclaim public funds, really begins with undoing Proposition 13.
That was Alice's polite way of saying, you're the oldest person on the panel. Let me say this to get started. I graduated from college in 1978, the year that Proposition 13 passed. And I was asked by my fellow students to give our class speech. And I know that what I should have done is to thank my hardworking immigrant parents for having provided some opportunities for me to get ahead. Probably should have thanked the state of California for having affirmative action, since that's probably what really made the difference. But instead, I spent my speech, because Prop 13 had just passed, saying that I thought that Prop 13 was a declaration of generational warfare, and it would shipwreck the state of California for decades to come. So it shows you first what a wise young man I was. But I want to say something about Prop 13. Prop 13 came about in the 1970s when property values were rising rapidly, and there was a legitimate concern about older homeowners on a fixed income seeing their property values rise with the market, and as a result, their taxes rising with the market and perhaps getting priced out of their homes. That was a particular worry for low-income seniors. But what could have been solved with a scalpel was instead bludgeoned with a sledgehammer. And we got something that rolled back property values to 1975 that wound up limiting property tax assessments to no more than 2%. And was not just about residential property, but also covered commercial and industrial property. So you wind up today with things like Disneyland's tax base is still from 1975. I like to say that's probably why it's the happiest place on earth. I mean, if I was paying those taxes, I'd be delighted too. And because commercial and industrial property doesn't turn over, as rapidly as residential property, we've seen a massive shift from a reliance primarily in the 1970s on property taxes from commercial and industrial property to a reliance now on residential property, because that does turn over. But the really important thing to realize is what drove it and what its consequences have been. There were racial underpinnings to Proposition 13. Basically, when you think about it, it froze the property tax assessments for an older, wider generation of homeowners, just as a newer, younger, more diverse generation was entering the housing market and was going to wind up paying full freight. And it is not coincidental that the leading forces for Prop 13 actually came from the same group that had fought busing as a way of school desegregation. And it's not coincidental that the 1970s was the decade in which the share of children who were children of color grew by more than at any other time in California's history before or since. And the consequences of it were that California, which used to be in the top 10 of the states in terms of spending per capita on students, K-12 students, is now in the bottom 10. So just as a new generation of homeowners were arriving, they got saddled with the full property tax assessments. And just as a new generation of more diverse students are rising, they got cheated with less than adequate resources. And interestingly, it was kind of like the Trump tax cuts, which is that they were a Trojan horse for basically a lot of corporate property owners to be able to get their break. Now, the really interesting thing is that what's being proposed by Schools and Communities First would correct that problem on the commercial and industrial side. It's actually more economically efficient because you've got a number of firms that are paying taxes that are very low, that are historic, and so the property is not being used to its highest and best use. So it's actually economically inefficient, and it would generate about you said 12, but probably more like 10 to $11 billion of additional tax revenues. But the fight about this is going to be much bigger than 10 to $11 billion in additional revenues for a general fund that's about 150 billion with overall state budget that's about 220 billion. The fight's going to be outsized about that 10 to 11 billion. And the reason is the symbolism. Because if we take what happened in 1978 and say, we understand its racial underpinnings, we understand that it was a Trojan horse that was supposed to protect the elderly, but instead protected giant corporations. And if we wise up and say, we're not buying that any longer, the symbolism of that for what we can do in California going forward is tremendous. And so the fight around Schools and Communities First, it's going to be the amount of money that corporate leaders are going to spend against us is not going to equal the additional taxes that they might save, because they understand that what this is really about is saying, we are a different California. We are a California that will now not allow ourselves to be race baited. We are a California that's not going to allow ourselves to see a tax cut for business be used as a trickle-down tax benefit for the middle class. We are a different California looking forward, which knows that we need to invest in schools and in communities to be able to have a productive California going forward. This is the fight of our generation.
Thank you, Manuel, for helping us to set the stage, and especially for explaining the underpinnings and explaining the history in such a concise way of Prop 13 and why it's so important to undo it. In the interest of time and in the interest of getting some questions from the audience, I'm going to sprinkle in some of those questions here, and also invite both David and Marisela to speak to the importance of Prop 13 the struggle against Prop 13, the importance of Prop 15, of passing Prop 15 to their ongoing work in answering some of these questions. One question from the field, this is the question that doesn't often come up in these fora, so I'm going to ask it here. We're hearing of the great work from Cause and other nonprofits and student groups. As a business owner, I'd love to hear what the panelists suggest are the key strategies that businesses, in all caps, businesses should deploy in supporting the movement for intersectional, social, and climate justice. So let me start with Marisela and David on that one. And then
thank you. So two answers. The long-term one is about the movement building, that we could have in this region a progressive movement that included businesses. About 10 years ago, Cause spent some time, we didn't end up having the bandwidth to continue it, but to start a triple bottom line business network. And there was interest. And we know that there are a lot of small business owners and even larger businesses are progressive people, that are people that get, you know, the shared analysis that, you know, we have to, you know, uproot racism and inequality, etc. But they're not organized. And so the long-term thing that businesses can do is organize, progressive businesses, small businesses. We need that voice. It's lacking. In the immediate, you can sign up as a small business in support of Schools and Communities First. One of the things that we have to lift up to win this is that Schools and Communities First gives one of the biggest tax incentives in a generation to small businesses. And we need to get that information out, and who better to get that information out than business people themselves, who are more likely to be, you know, believed. Because that is I would say the number one question I get when I talk to leaders, including, you know, quote unquote progressive leaders. What about small businesses? What's going to happen to them? This will not directly affect small businesses, or even indirectly. There are many things that go into what a business's rent is. And similar to the myth, when we're trying to increase the minimum wage, where that is the first thing that the conservative organized business base says is, oh, we're going to have to lay everybody off because we have to, you know, increase the minimum wage. And it's a myth. Many things go into what results in mass layoffs. And it's not just simply increasing the minimum wage. In this case, in creating a plain level field amongst businesses starting today as the ones that existed in '75, small businesses are not going to be impacted, and we need business people to share that message. And so to learn more, I would really encourage people to go to the Schools and Communities First website, where there is a lot of this information. But today, between now and the November election, we need businesses to speak up. Yes to Prop 15.
Mhm.
Can I echo that? That is such an important point. When you look at the way that Schools and Communities First got designed, because of a process of dialogue. There's an exception for businesses with assets of less than $3 million. There's different, the most important tax burden for a small business is the tax on their business inventory, and there's relief for that. And also a lot of small businesses are recent startups, and the current tax system actually discourages the kind of recent startup stuff. So I think the point that Marisela is making is absolutely accurate, and we need to get the information out there. I would say something else which I think is really important. I really want to thank Eric Cardenas for asking that question in the chat, which is it's not just small business either. One of the things I was struck by several years ago, I gave a talk at a major bank, and the bank president actually waited around at the end of the line to talk to me, which I thought, like, shouldn't you be doing something more important than waiting? But he did. And this is someone who's benefited tremendously from the current system. And he said, you know, I just think it's not fair any longer. I think what people have realized is that this level of inequality is corrosive to our politics, to our society, and even to the economy. When you've got such a level of inequality and built-in perpetuation of privilege that is by class and by race, even when you're a winner, you feel bad because you won in a really rigged system. And you also, as a business owner, know that a system this rigged is denying you talent. Think about how many young Black people who are creative, talented, able to be productive in so many ways have been chewed up by a racist police system. Or how many of our immigrant brothers and sisters who could start fantastic businesses but are not able to access all of the formal resources that they need because of their lack of documentation status. We realize that these inequities are holding us back.
David?
Yeah, I would say just echo everything that's been said, and thank Eric for that question as well. And You know, businesses, and I'm gonna sound like a free marketer here, but businesses are often far more nimble than the government, right? I mean, that's a fact. And this is why, you know, I was making the point earlier about thinking more broadly about public policy and changes that we can make in our lives to materially improve our communities. Right now, we're actually seeing businesses do that in response to this particular moment around Black Lives Matter. And I applaud that. We've seen it at Unilever, we've seen it at Adidas, we've seen it at, you know, Bon Appetit, we've seen it at many, many organizations. And so that's one thing I would say, respond to this moment with policies that reflect listening to this moment and to this movement and reflect the needs of our broader communities. And as Marisela and Manuel were saying, this is a way to be economically more sustainable. Look, I've often joked about what would it be like to live in one of those far off countries. We've got a crazy frickin' dictator. You've got an economy in free fall, a healthcare system in shambles, and ethnic and racial strife rampant in the streets. Boom, I got my wish. I'm here in the United States of America. So even the most ardent supporter of Donald Trump cannot look you in the eye and say that Trump policies have actually been good for this country or the world, and certainly cannot say they've been good for the economy. So that's one thing. You know, to be really direct, I would say one of the things that I have enjoyed most in my position as the chair of an academic department at a large public university is that I'm often meeting with donors and prospective donors from the business community. And it is folks like that who are responsible for some of the most important support for various educational and curricular initiatives. And so, you know, I think about what's going on with Proposition 15. If that thing passes, and if businesses come out and support that, then the kinds of curricular initiatives that I'd love to see in our school systems around, for example, ethnic studies, which, you know, it's hard to poo-poo the necessity for that now, given what was happening with racism in this country, and the necessity for a deeper engagement with environmental and climate justice curriculum and education. Businesses can lead in terms of supporting that kind of work. And so this is really, really an important question. And so thank you.
Okay. So since we only have a few minutes left, I'm going to combine first, with apologies to everyone who asked questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to combine two questions for sort of a last question I'd like each of the panelists to discuss. And that is a combination of questions that come from Chuck Flax and Nancy Weiss. Chuck's question is, what would it take for this moment to become a movement? What do we need from leaders locally to make that happen? And from Nancy Weiss, a very pragmatic question. Thank you, Nancy. How can people join you and get involved? I want to note here that we have sent out the link to the Schools and Communities First website, but anything else anyone wants to say about how people in this Zoom room and others can get involved, go for it. So who wants to jump in on that
David
one?
or Marisela, why don't you go first?
Yeah, well, would love to add you to our email list, and you can sign up at our website, www.causenow.org. For instance, right now we have a petition going to address COVID-19 and farm worker, essential worker, basic protections and safety. I think in terms of what we need from leadership is, you know, we're seeing young leaders more and more, you know, people on the front lines coming forth and being what some would call, you know, visionary and aggressive about that vision. And what we need local leaders is to follow suit. This isn't the time to you know, be, you know, wondering, well, you know, can that really happen? You know, what will be the ramifications? We are at a crossroads as humanity in terms of the environment and in terms of our soul and our heart. with regards to racism, you know, and with those things, we have to step out as leaders and stop being so cautious. You know, those, you know, quote unquote, you know, progressive leaders who, you know, are still fearful. I mean, we have as leaders so much safety. And those that are, you know, have their lives on the line, you know, are out there, they need us to step up too and not be afraid, and push the envelope and be in solidarity with them and follow them. So this is the time for us to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I would say, you know, recognizing that in terms of moving from a moment to a movement, recognizing that this is an incredible turn of events where the kinds of ideas that were impossible or would have been ridiculed and marginalized just a few months ago are now mainstream. I mean, defunding and divesting from the police, for example, which, by the way, follows on the heels of ideas such as Medicare for all and abolishing ICE, things that were only coming off the lips of fringe radical activists over the years, but now are being taken quite seriously. So supporting, I would say, your wildest dreams and being bold and to seize this moment to turn it into a movement by not only dreaming what was previously prohibited dreams, but also listening. Angela Glover Blackwell, a colleague of many of ours on this call, says one of the most important tools and skills of an organizer and a change maker is listening. And so I would say dream bold, listen, and act. And in terms of getting involved, definitely check out CAUSE. It's the most incredible organization I've ever worked with. Community Environmental Council here in Santa Barbara is doing good work. We need your support there. And you know, at UCSB, there are a number of units and entities, not just environmental studies or the Global Environmental Justice Project, but many different centers and student organizations that are making change that could use your support and imagination and resources.
So this is a gigantic moment. I think what David said about what was once unthinkable becoming possible. And it's not just the stuff that's come up around George Floyd, like defunding the police, but universal basic income, which is basically what the United States did in the context of this crisis. Or the fact that you could run a $4 trillion deficit to juice the economy. Unthinkable. It's something that we're doing. Or understanding that essential work is a grocery store clerk, or a driver, or an orderly, and not the manager of a hedge fund, no matter how well he or she might be rewarded. So I think this is a moment in which the imagination is being stretched, and there's just extraordinarily deep realizations. And I think the biggest advice I would give is to be aware of the difference between a moment and a movement, and not allow this moment to escape without feeding in to a movement that can actually structurally change things. And I would be remiss to some of the partners that are on this call if I didn't also add that every movement needs to be undergirded with data. And one of the things that we're all working on together is the idea of an equity profile of the Central Coast, because you can't fix what you don't measure. And we tend not to measure disparities and disaggregate them by race and nativity and gender and a variety of other experiences. And until we get the data in front of us to recognize that, yes, Houston, we do have a problem. We are not really going to have the willingness to move ahead and address it. So big vision, grounded in data.
Yes. Okay. And also grounded in concrete opportunities to make change, which is what Schools and Communities First represents. So on that note, I want to thank all of our panelists, Manuel, David, Marisela, for doing such a wonderful job of responding to these big questions and also bringing it home to us. I want to thank everyone who participated, and I want to ask for your ongoing engagement. I want also to ask everybody to use Schools and Communities First as the unbelievable moment for educating people that it is, especially about the fiscal stranglehold that Proposition 13 has been holding over us for such a long time. And again, thanks to the fund and to Alice as our interpreter. And I encourage everyone, please, as well, to follow up with those links, get in touch with the fund, get in touch with CAUSE, Schools and Communities First, Communities Environmental Council. And I think on that note, we are just about out of time. So thanks again, and onward. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.